Well, here we are again, people. I have told fishermen and those that live in the fishing communities, you have been betrayed by Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage doesn't care about you. Now that he has left, now that we've left the European Union, he will not care, continue to not care about you. Wave so long and farewell for him speaking to you in any way, form of representation. You've failed in the fishing communities. You've lost so much. Remember, 80% of the British catch is sold on into Europe. So that is an industry that has lost 80% of its revenue stream as of December, possibly next year. And if you think that Johnson is going to fight for you in any way, shape, or form, you can forget it. The British fishing industry, GDP wise, is worth less than like 0.1%. It's nothing to this country. It employs roughly around 12,000 people. You will be sacrificed on an altar for something else. And yet, it was the key point of the Brexit campaign. It was what was summed up to be, quote, everything that was wrong with Europe. But you relied on people, on a person who didn't care about you. It took a TV chef, and I keep on saying this over and over again, it took a TV chef to get changes made that you wanted, that your representative, Nigel Farage, after only turning up to one meeting, didn't represent you at all, when he could have. And I will keep on using that as a cudgel to beat Nigel Farage with, over the head with. And any Brexiteer who thinks that somehow we can't do anything in Europe, or never could do anything in Europe. But there you go. Anyway, this comes from the Times, and this sums up exactly what is going to happen to the fishing industry. You're not going to get a damn thing. You will be filed away and forgotten. But there you go. So, the fishing industry played a central role in the Brexit campaign as a symbol of all that was supposedly wrong with the EU. The tale of how it was betrayed in negotiations over Britain's entry into the European communities in 1973 supplied the original stab-in-the-back narrative that sustained the anti-EU cause for 47 years. Brussels demanded that Britain open up its waters to rapacious foreign trawlers was a disaster for British fishing. Leaving the EU was an opportunity to reverse this historic injustice by quitting the hated common fisheries policy and taking back control of Britain's waters. Yet, as so often with the Brexit, this narrative was almost entirely wrong. It was not the EEC, as it was then, which brought the foreign fishing fleet into Britain's waters. They had been fishing them for centuries. The fisheries policy, for the most part, codified fishing rights that had already existed by allocating quotas to European fishing fleets based on historic catches. It was true that the British fleet dwindled after joining the fisheries policy, but that was true of fishing fleets everywhere, whether or not they were in the CPF or not, reflecting the trend towards larger ships and increased industrialisation, which is really at the heart of all this. Most of what we consider fishing, indeed the people who are complaining, are these people who own tiny boats versus the massive trawlers. Remember, these tiny boats, which are the many people who complain about fishing that they own or even work on, can do in a month what it takes these massive trawlers to do in a day. You know, sorry, that's industrialization in a nutshell. The reason why, what the people really should be complaining is lack of investment in their industries and failing to keep up. One of the things that you'll never hear these guys talk about is the fact that banks have refused to offer loans to these people numerous times. Has Nigel Farage ever talked about that? Nope. Has the European Union offered these people grants and loans to subsidise them and help them on these things, to help their communities in these facts? Yes. Once again, the European Union looking out for fishermen when the people who claim to do don't give a monkeys. So anyway, it continues. If the British industry declined faster than others, it was due part to a domestic political decision, unique in Europe, to allow British fishermen to sell their quotas. In a depressingly familiar story of British short-termism, many businesses took the opportunity to cash out rather than invest. The result is more than half of Britain's quotas is held by the Dutch, the Spanish and Icelandic-owned ships sailing under British flags. More than half of Northern Ireland's quota is hoarded onto a single trawler. One Dutch multinational controls a quarter of England's quota. So once again, this is not the EU's fault. This was the UK government doing this to UK fishermen, not the EU. Anyway, we continue. That is not to deny that there may have been problems with the CPF over the years. It took too long to grapple effectively with the problem of overfishing. The result was that some fishing grounds had to be closed and quotas cut to allow the stocks to revive. That included restrictions on North Sea cod fishing, which is important to the UK market. Nevertheless, the recent reforms that Britain played a leading role in shaping appear to have addressed many of these issues. And people say that we had no say in Europe. It is important to note that the CPF brought benefits to the UK fishing industry too. The reality is that Britain imports 70% of the fish it eats, such as the cod and the haddock, but exports 80% of the fish it catches, mostly to the EU. And we've talked about this before, about how as a country we don't eat a lot of fish anymore. We used to back in the past, but not anymore, because of how cheap meat is now and how freely available it is. That's not going to change anytime soon. Anyway, it continues. British waters are rich in species such as Lingosternus, I think that's how you say it, and crab, which are popular in France and Spain, and mackerel and herring, which are sold in Northern Europe. By opening up new markets for British caught fish, EU membership helped create a thriving processing industry in Britain, and as even numbers employed in catching fish dwindled. So as you can see, as the fishermen jobs decreased, the processing side of it, because again, as we've said, the smaller boats can do in about a month what it takes these big trawlers to do in a day. It's industrialisation that has affected the British fishing industry, and the fact that the British government hasn't done anything really to help them. But there you go. Anyway, it continues. Yet, Brexiteers characteristically promised that the fishing industry, that outside the EU, Britain could have its cake and eat it. Britain would become an independent coastal nation again, they said, taking back control of its own territorial waters, which under the UN law of the sea extended to 200 miles from the coast. It would be up to the British government to decide how much access, if any, to allow to foreign ships. Bear in mind, we've already sold off those quotas to foreign companies, so they're not going anywhere. Where are we? If any, to allow to foreign ships. British fishermen were told that they could expect massive increase in quotas without any restrictions on their ability to sell their catches in European markets. This, of course, is a fantasy. Britain's fishing fleet almost certainly doesn't have the capacity to catch all the fish in British waters, and even if it did, it would certainly need access to European markets to sell them. But the EU has been clear that the price of access to its markets must be access to its fishing fleets to British waters. There is no reason to believe that this is a bluff, given how many EU countries have their own, often highly militant fishing industries to worry about. Under the EU's Council's own negotiating guidelines, the EU wants a deal that would guarantee existing access to be maintained. Senior EU figures have also suggested that access to EU markets for Britain's financial services could hinge upon agreeing to such a deal on fish. So bear in mind, we are a service-based economy. 80% of our entire economy is based on services. Compare that to less than the 1% of the fishing industry. What do you think is going to be sacrificed? That has prompted a talk of a major clash later this year. But it is hard to believe that Mr. Johnson is really going to die on another of his famous ditches over an industry that generates less than 1% of GDP and just employs just 12,000 people. Besides, some parts of the industry, not least fishing processors, will be pressing for a deal. Environment Secretary Theresa Villas this week introduced a bill in Parliament in which legally guarantees Britain will leave the CPF, but the government will have little choice but to negotiate a new deal that looks remarkably similar to the CPF. Oh, sorry, yeah, that's the Common Fisheries Policy, by the way. How Mr. Johnson sells that deal to those whose expectations he's so recklessly raised remains to be seen. So we'll be keeping an eye on this, but I guarantee you're going to be seeing fishing boats in the Thames. I guarantee you by the end of this year, at some point it's going to happen. I'll tell you now, Nigel Farage ain't be on those boats.